I wasn't able to figure out why my bug doesn't happen. So that's good news, everyone, I guess. The bad news is it doesn't give me a good excuse to show you something else that I wanted to show you, so we're going to have to sort of fabricate it, which sucks. I hate doing things that like don't have an obvious reason why, but this is what we're going to do anyway. Let's say. Actually, sorry. There's one before we go back to that particular bug. There is one other problem that we need to deal with, which Hamish noticed. That is that if we try to delete an office, we get exceptions. Or, sorry, if we try to delete a company, we get exceptions. So just to demonstrate that real quick here, let's add a company, and then delete the company. Really?
You didn't add any offices.
Oh, I didn't have any offices. Right. That's the problem. Thank you. Okay. All right. It is really Thursday. Okay, so if we try to delete a company that has offices, we get this foreign key constraint. We get an integrity constraint violation saying that this foreign key doesn't references something that's not there.
That's the right thing, right?
Well.
Or it should go and delete office also.
Exactly. So if we delete a company, we should delete all of the offices that are associated with the company, right? That was something that we had forgotten to deal with in the code so far. So let's deal with it. What's the easy way?
Company controller.
Go to company controller. And whenever we delete a company, we want to. We want to delete all of its offices. There's an easier way though.
And you're going to delete all the addresses.
Cascade.
Oh, no, because address is already cascade.
Cascade. Yeah, just cascade the delete, right? Right. Right. That's like that way should work. But
delete, just the delete, right?
Well, we should probably cascade all, right? Like if we want to refresh a company, we'd want cascade.refresh. I mean, all that kind of stuff. So cascade equals cascade type dot all. And that should deal with our problem. All right. So let's go and make sure that this works. I'm apparently running in the debugger for some reason. Whatever. All right, here we go. Contacts. So we'll add a new company called Tesla. Everything's Tesla. We'll add an office. We'll go back to the company. We'll delete it, and so we should now have an empty contact list, and that's good. What we should see if we go to the training database log is we should see this whole cascade of deletions, right? You delete from the office, you delete from the address, you delete from company, and you also delete from contact, right? Because we've got that we're mapping the inheritance there. Yeah, so when we delete a company, we're getting this whole cascade of deletions. Again, really nice to be able to deal with that in one line of code rather than to have to manage all that explicitly. Right?
Is that the order correct? First deleting of office and then comment?
The order doesn't matter as long as we haven't committed yet. Yeah, exactly. Why does this happen all in one transaction?
Otherwise we get integrity.
Well, yeah. Otherwise, we'd have a problem. But I mean, how does it know to do this in one transaction? Or let me ask a different question. What if we did it the way that you were suggesting, going through and deleting all of the offices?
We have to manually take care of all the dependencies and all the cascades, right?
Yeah. So if we were deleting all of the company's offices first.
You have to also take care of the addresses, right?
So it's simply cascades, right? One after another.
Yeah. So it's simply cascading, right?
If
Hold-
we do it
hold-
all by
hold on.
ourselves, then we don't have any control over the comment. So
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So
So if we did here, let's do it, right? We can go to our company controller, and in post delete company we need to we need to have a office repository, right?
Yeah.
So we have an office repository, and then we need to, actually, we don't need to do for each. We can say office repository dot delete, and we can pass it a list of entities to delete. So company repository dot find one ID dot get offices. We'll see what we get out of that.
No, but this wouldn't work, right?
You didn't
Because
delete the cascade already.
addresses, right?
The cascade shouldn't matter if we delete the offices first anyway.
Oh, yeah.
Don't we have to delete addresses?
We've already said that those will cascade.
Oh,
We could do that too.
right.
Yeah.
We can go crazy.
Yeah. All right. So let's try it. Tesla. Add office. Tesla. Yeah, let's go back. We'll add another office just to have fun. Tesla office number 2. Back to Tesla. Edit company. Delete. So it works, right? If we look at our log, I'm expecting to see multiple transactions. Let's see. Oh, this is even stranger. Hang on.
I think you need to remove the cascade order to actually see the bug.
Maybe.
Because
Well-
it's trying to delete everything.
Well, actually, hang on, because this is demonstrating the bug. This is demonstrating the bug that I expected in the other case.
Yeah, correct.
This is demonstrating the bug that I was expecting to see when I was deleting offices. I don't know. I don't know what's causing it here. But so it's saying delete this office, and then we're going to insert a new office that doesn't have a reference to a company. The reference is null. So it's inserting garbage into the DB. It's then deleting this Tesla office number 2 and reinserting it with a null reference. Yeah, this was the bug that I was expecting.
Why is this why is it inserted?
Great question.
No answer?
I don't have a good answer for you.
Can you get the code when you're trying to delete? The controller code that we added?
I mean, this is a pretty straightforward thing that we are trying to do here.
Can you comment out the company repository.delete? Let's see what happens.
Sure. And I think that I think these are the lines that would be affected by that. I'm actually also surprised that there's no commit in between these.
Okay.
Yeah.
There wouldn't be, right?
I would think that there should be because it shouldn't know that.
Yeah, what we're trying to do in the next line.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I hate getting into situations that I can't explain to you.
You're trying to delete the office repositories. No, you didn't delete the offices. We put null into the DB.
Well, it deleted the offices and then recreated them with null, which is like even worse.
Yeah.
Well, we do have Cascade.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
he has to put null, right? Because in the database schema we have a company ID, right? That it's trying to.
Yeah, so it's still trying. I mean, basically, what I believe is happening is that we're saying that these companies don't exist anymore as far as, or that these offices don't exist in the company
Yeah.
anymore, but the company still exists.
You know what, I think if you don't have cascades defined, maybe the behavior will be different.
The behavior will be different.
There you might see multiple transactions.
Possible.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway.
Because these are like two mechanisms together, right?
Yeah, they're sort of conflicting.
We don't know what exactly is taking precedence over what, right?
Yeah, so what I'm going to try to do is back all of this out and pretend like it never happened to avoid further embarrassment. I mean, because honestly, I can't explain why it's doing this particular behavior.
I mean, this whole thing is, it's interesting, right? I mean, you see something, but then, as a user, as a developer, there's an explanation, and
Yeah. Right. Okay. So,
easy control for how things are done.
well, let's see. So here's the situation that I want to create. Maybe we'll see the bug a slightly different way, in a way that we can control a little bit better. Let's say that the way that I want to delete offices is not through the Office repository. Let's say instead that I want to just say that the company doesn't have that office anymore. This, I'm just sort of fabricating this just the same as we did our previous example. Let's say that we want, company equals office dot get company, and we want to say company dot get offices dot remove company, or sorry, office. We want that company not to have this office anymore, and we want to save. Sorry. We want to save that. In other words, we're orphaning this office. We're saying that this office doesn't belong to this company anymore.
But
We can delete the. Oh.
But you're not deleting offices, right?
Yeah, we're not deleting the office.
But then the
It's gonna be a
database
null.
would not allow you to, right? Because you have this.
Yeah, so-
defined.
Yeah, so I mean, like it comes down to a point where we're just coding Java, right?
Okay.
We have to worry at something like we've been very accustomed to worrying about what's going on in the database, but we also have to worry about what's going on in Java too. So let's run this and see what ends up happening.
Can you run it in debugger maybe?
Unfortunately, running it in the debugger won't show us very much. It'll show us that our objects are in the state that we expect, but then we'll get wrong behavior anyway. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the way that we're deleting this office, so go back to, so the way that we're going to delete this office is by removing it from the company that owns it, which doesn't work. It's still here. We tried removing it from the set, but that had no effect. And if we look at the database, you can see there's no delete. There's no delete at all. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, because we didn't really call controller to remove it, the repository to remove it.
Well, and see, this is the thing. This is again another case where this abstraction sort of leaks. Is we would expect that if we remove, see, Java's a garbage collected language, and we figure that if there's no further references to the office, right? I mean, we just we'll just think about our database as just being a logical extension of memory of our Java heap, right? So if we remove the office from the company, then we say, hey, that office should get garbage collected. But
Nobody's like
it doesn't. Yeah.
But the company doesn't have. The company still has that office.
Well, when we say this, and we, if we look at the state of this company object, basically
It doesn't have
what
offices.
Nipa was suggesting, like looking at it in the debugger, we'll see, in fact, like the company doesn't have that
You
office.
don't have offices in the debugger if you see, right?
Yeah.
But if in the UI, right?
But then yeah. So then we make another request, and in that other request, so we've done this post delete, and then we redirect, which causes the browser to make another request to the company page.
Then one question, this statement, right, company repository dot save company,
Mhm.
right? That company object doesn't have any offices, any reference to the offices, right?
Yes.
So when that database call is made, what would it do with the offices? I mean, it doesn't have access.
Well,
to the offices,
apparently
right?
nothing, right? Yeah. Well, it should have access, right?
No, it should not, right? Because really, the company object doesn't have any reference to the office.
It has.
Line number.
You have a set
Yeah, it
of
has.
offices.
We've got this. We've said
No,
that.
no, go back. To the here line whatever that company repository dot save company, right?
Uh huh.
It is trying to.
Oh, I see what you're saying. It doesn't have a reference to
Exactly.
the office that it needs to do something with.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
And you would expect that maybe JPA would be able to track the change, it'd be able to track the delta somehow, but no, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Okay, no explanation why the GPU. I guess my point is at this point, how does it work? I guess that's what I'm not able to understand.
Well, the issue
You
is
save
the issue is that it doesn't, right? The way so so.
But further, like what is happening when you do dot save and when you're passing the company object which doesn't have references to offices, right? What is exactly happening, right? At that point, it goes to the database layer, right?
Well, what is it doing, right? It looks at the company's owning the fields that the company object owns and sees if there's any changes to those.
It doesn't own the offices, right?
But it doesn't own the
That's
offices.
why I think it's not working.
Yeah.
Because the company table doesn't have anything.
Right.
It only has the ID of the company.
Right. Right. So because it's the inverse side of that many-to-one relationship.
So
Exactly.
the idea is you should also always delete from the owning side if you want things to be working.
Typically delete from the owning side.
Terrible.
Right. So there is a way to do it if you want to do it this way, though. This was introduced in JPA 2.0, and it is very helpful. See, logically, we want to so physically in the database, the owning side of the relationship is the office. Logically, we want to think about the owning side as the company. Right, that's why we have this cascade type of all, right? If we delete a company, then we want to delete all the offices, right? We can introduce one more thing, which is this orphan removal. So this lets us keep pretending like we're the owner.
Okay.
So let's try this. Let's try this. Run this. So when we say orphan removal equals true, basically it's gonna keep track of the non-owning things before and after, right? And figure out what to do. Add a new company. Add a new office. Delete the office. And it's gone. All right. And we did that through even though this was physically the non-owning side, we're still able to
Can you look at
pretend
the
like it
log?
is.
What log?
Sure. Yeah. And this is, by the way, like we did this as a workaround, sort of, but this is actually the correct thing to do. You know, even if in the Office controller we do the deletion the way that we had done it before, by just deleting the Office, it's still the right way to do it. You know, in case somewhere else we're more focused on the companies. Okay.
And this is interesting, right? You can write code where you introduce these bugs and you scratch your head to figure out why
Yeah.
it's using.
I mean, honestly, that's been my experience with Hibernate. Yeah, I don't like Hibernate.
It just feels like losing control. If you write everything by yourself, you know what you're doing and how you're doing it, it's going to tell
Yeah.
you. But with this abstraction, it seems that things are hidden and sometimes it can become very tricky to figure out.
Yeah. I want to make sure that this still works, even though I've changed the controller to just delete the Office directly now. Yeah. All right. So it still works.
So you said you don't like Hibernate. What would you do?
It's tough. I mean, basically, I think ORMs just don't work in general. I think having something that abstracts SQL in a different way, because obviously we're not hiding the database. Like they're kind of there's no way to actually hide the database. So having some sort of a language level DSL for SQL to at least make it easier to write SQL in Java. That's I think better. It's not as abstract. It's more direct.
It's not an option in Java, right?
But yeah, DSLs in Java suck. I mean, it's still doable. Basically, like if you have sort of a really crazy sophisticated version of the builder pattern. Like the builder pattern is like the only way that you can write DSLs in Java at all, right? Have objects that chain and chain and chain and chain, or methods that chain. So,
I'm sorry, what is DSL?
a domain-specific language, or an embedded DSL, an embedded domain-specific language within Java. So you know, it just kind of hypothetically, right? I would have something like this is imagining Java code, right? I would select, where, so some where clause, right? Something like this, So this looks very SQL-like, but maybe we can still at least abstract away the differences between different SQL dialects,
Okay.
right? So I can have one of these that's like HSQL, and another one that's like, MySQL or whatever. And
Is any other decent option exist?
no,
In Java, you mean?
in Java, yeah.
Java, I'm also otherwise.
in
C#,
right? In C# you have link,
yeah,
right?
What is it called?
link. So basically,
LINQ.
you have language. C# itself has select query
Yeah.
statements in the language.
Yeah. So link is spelled LINQ. It's supposed to stand for language integrated queries.
So you could basically, instead of a table, you could substitute it with a container seamlessly, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's similar to what they've been trying to do in Scala. You were asking about Scala yesterday, right? Scala, there's a few things like this in Scala. One of them is called slick, which is supposed to be very much like link. And in fact, standard SQL databases isn't the only thing that we like to abstract this way. Like let's say, for example, you wanted to think of your big data query, your Hadoop jobs as being very very much like this as well.
Right.
So assembling some sort of a query that gets translated into a series of MapReduce phases, right? So that also exists for actually it exists for Java as well. It's a library called Cascading. That's useful. That's useful for doing Hadoop stuff, but that's for MapReduce. There isn't something like that for SQL that I know of. Yeah.
So SQL, the only option is either you raw JDBC or Hibernate. DSL.
I mean, I think somebody's probably implemented something like this. I just haven't seen it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware either. So
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. So that's orphan removal. All right. So I think that's our complete discussion on horrible bugs. Even though the most horrible of the bugs was that my bug didn't exist. Okay, we talked about lazy associations. Let's talk. All right, let's talk about Spring at a high level because a couple of you guys were asking to see sort of a bigger picture of Spring. Well, let's see, Spring 3 docs. Here we go. Is there like a top link or something?
Search in images.
There we go.
Oh, you're looking for the, okay.
There we go. This is the diagram that you were looking at, right? Yeah. So kind of high level overview of Spring, and let me make sure that I'm recording while we do this. Yeah. All right. This is actually a fairly incomplete picture. I mean, Spring has like a whole ton of subprojects that aren't even represented in here, but the ones that we're using are. So let's talk about it. Basically, the Spring typically sits inside of a servlet container, or a Java enterprise application server of whatever sort, right? So this is sort of where we would start out with actually wait, that's kind of not. Sorry, that's not the right place to start out with. Sorry, forget what I said the last 30 seconds. That only really relates to servlet. Okay, sorry. They're similar in a way though, right? There are two different managed environments. Remember, like early in the week, we started out by saying that our container was going to be managing Hibernate. Our container was going to be managing our database. So we have this container managed stuff. And how did we do it? We had sort of a rudimentary form of dependency injection, in fact, in our managed environment. Do you guys remember what that was? Like when we wanted to get, on Monday, when we wanted to get a data source, how did we do that?
Back to the XML.
So we did some XML configuration to make sure that you could look it up by name, right? And then what else? Like in the Java code, how did we?
JNDI.
JNDI, yes, right. We looked it up. We did a lookup. So that was sort of our rudimentary form of dependency injection. Was we said, hey, we need something that satisfies this criteria, and the container should be able to provide it. So Spring, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but Spring is very similar. We set up the container to be able to provide certain things, and then we can ask for them. The way that we ask for them is slightly different, right? In JNDI, we have to do we have to get the context and then request the thing by name. In Spring, we can actually do something similar. You can actually get the application context object and look something up look up a bean by name and get it. But there's a nicer way, which is to use that auto-wired annotation, right? We can do annotation-based injection. We can also do something called setter injection or constructor injection. But the point is that they're very similar, managed environments, right?
So AutoWire essentially looks up the object in the Spring's database, object database, and brings it to you
Without any more code.
having to do any
Yeah.
JNDI or any of that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Alternative would be, for example, let's have a look real quick at our Office controller. Right. So here we've said we need an Office repository and we need a company repository. But we were talking yesterday about what's a more sort of standard Java way of saying that somebody's going to give me an Office repository.
Factory.
Simpler.
Constructor.
Instantiate.
Yeah, just in the constructor, or maybe in a setter, right? So before we didn't have this auto-wired annotation, right? This auto-wired annotation is actually doing some sort of AOP. This is actually generating some code for us. The code that it's generating essentially is a setter method, or something like a setter method. And we could write that setter method ourselves. We could have a set company repository method, and what would happen so this Office controller, for example, is managed by Spring. We've said so because we've got this controller annotation. So when Spring instantiates an Office controller, what is it going to do? It'll just call our setter method, right? Okay. So that's what sort of this core container is all about. We have a context that contains the objects that are managed and contains information on how to construct those objects, right? I'm not sure what it means by core here, but basically,
That's the dependency injection. Right?
I mean, I'm sort of thinking of all of this as I might not be thinking about it really the correct way, but yeah. So this stuff is all about managing the life cycle of Java beans. These things that have setters, or at least maybe constructors. Spring knows how to construct these objects. You always have to start from somewhere, right? You need one container managed object, or multiple, right? I can't. So here's something about Spring. Let's say I have an object that I construct myself. I say, new foo. Can I get Spring to inject anything into my foo if I say new foo? No. Yeah. That's sort of a problem. There are other dependency injection frameworks. One that's pretty popular is called Juice. It was made by Crazy Bob Lee at Google. He's the CTO at Square now, so but he still does a lot of open source work. Anyway, Juice will let you inject things into things that you've created. So sort of different model, but in Spring you can't. Basically, you can only inject managed objects into other managed objects. So it's sort of viral, right? You end up with, basically when you start using Spring just takes over your whole world. So you have this whole network of managed objects that end up sort of taking form.
And the management part of Spring is essentially AOP injection and lifecycle management.
It's all about lifecycle management, right? That's all this core stuff.
So one question, when you say managed objects, right? Can you have non-managed objects within Spring environment? Or how would you say it's a managed object just because we have this internet? Is there an annotation for that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of ways to do it. If you look again at application context XML, we're explicitly saying here, for example, that this Bones CP data source is a managed object. This entity manager factory is a managed object. This transaction manager is a managed. So any bean that we declare in here in our application context is going to be something that Spring will construct for us. So we get two things, right? Spring knows how to construct these, and Spring knows how to inject these into other stuff. Of course, that other stuff also has to be managed objects. And that's really the core of Spring. That's the dependency injection framework. Okay, so that's how we declare managed objects, but we have some other managed objects in our system that we didn't declare here, right?
Yeah.
Right, like our controllers.
Right.
So, you know, it used to, again, before we had all this annotation-driven stuff, it used to be that we had to literally declare all of our beans in here. But, I mean, it's really kind of a pain in the butt to do that because sometimes you might miss something, especially if you have, like, a few different copies of your application context for, you know, your different deployment scenarios. Like, it's easy to screw stuff up. So over here, one way, and there's many different ways to say that something is a managed object, but controller is one of them. Everything under org Spring Framework stereotype. I don't know why the terminology is stereotype. I'm not sure what stereotype is supposed to mean. But the most general way of declaring that something is a managed component is you would annotate it as component. So that's something that we can do. For example,
That's an alternative to specifying it in the XML, right?
correct, yeah. So for example, let's say that we want, one thing that we mentioned yesterday was that having all of our business logic in the controllers it can maybe get messy. Like maybe our controllers should be pretty thin and we should have some separate objects that deal with the actual business logic. So what would I do? You know, I would probably have a, you know, I'd probably just have like a contacts manager, something like that. So some new class like this, I'll put it under Maracana contacts. I'll call it my contacts manager. And I'll say that, you know, my contacts manager is going to be my main business object, right? So, and we're going to say that our controllers, you know, my company controller, my contact controller, all those things are going to use the contacts manager to implement all of their functionality. So I need to be able to inject it. I need to be able to inject a contacts manager into my controllers. So I would say that the contacts manager is a Spring component.
Without the annotation, you wouldn't be able to.
Without the annotation, we wouldn't be able to, right? So our contacts manager would have our, you know, would probably have our repositories and stuff. And then in our controllers, I would auto-wire a private contacts manager, right? And I think, oops. And I think that certainly that'd be a better design, right?
So another related question. Let's say, I mean, what objects I would define as managed object? Like for here,
Yeah.
I understand because you want.
Yeah, good question.
Right?
Basically, anything that's sort of well, let me stand up for this one because this is a discussion I like to have. Have you guys heard? This is just sort of like software like design terminology that some people talk about, some people don't. Do you guys ever talk about like the difference between value objects versus service objects?
Value versus what?
Value objects or value classes versus service objects or service classes. Like what would I mean? What would be a value? What's a value? Like the number one's a value.
Entity.
Yeah, or entities maybe are values, right? But they're data, right? They're not business logic. They're data, right? Traditional object-oriented programming philosophy says that your
Merge the two.
yeah, that the two are sort of together, right? You know, your data has related behaviors. I generally think that's actually bad design. I think that leads to really spaghetti code, really unmodular code, because I don't necessarily know what my data objects are going to be used for, so I don't want to bake any assumptions into those objects, right? So that's, so strings, numbers, companies, contacts, right? Those I would say are all value objects. They have some useful data. I can compare instances of them. That's a big deal, right? To be able to say, is this company equal to that company? Yeah, so it probably has an equals method and a hashcode method. Maybe we haven't implemented that, but right, right. Those are values, right? That's what I mean by a value object. So contrast that then with service objects. What would a service object be? A controller would be a good example.
Dispatcher.
Yeah, any of this stuff relating to handling requests, talking to the database, business logic, it's the logic that deals with our values, right? And I think it's generally good practice to think about those as very separate things, right? You'll notice that our entities, I haven't put any behavior on those entities. Our entities are dumb, and they should be. I think that's the best idea, right? So, rule of thumb then to answer your question, which things should Spring manage and which things shouldn't Spring manage? Based on this, what do you think?
So all the service
Yeah,
objects should be
yeah. Basically, any of our service objects, they're essentially going to be singletons anyway, right? I'm going to have a company controller instance. I'm going to have a contact repository instance, right? Now I'm going to have like one instance of these things, and I'll just be able to use them from anywhere, right? These are just the services or the logic in my system. So Spring can manage that, and that's fine, right? Yeah. So rule of thumb then, when you're using Spring, is I think good idea to have your business logic in some sort of a component, and then inject that component wherever you need it. Right. This is much cleaner than having to like get the contacts manager from the contacts manager factory or something like that, because which is just going to be doing the same thing anyway. The contacts manager factory is just going to have a singleton instance of contacts manager. Right. Letting Spring manage all this stuff lets us not worry about any interdependencies between them. It just sort of figures it all out by itself.
So you don't even have to define your service classes as singleton?
Don't have to. Yeah,
You don't have to.
don't have to. Now, that's an interesting question. This gets more into advanced Spring stuff. We can say, by default, this contacts manager, do I know if it's a singleton instance, or do I know, is Spring going to create a new instance every time I request one? We don't actually know. We could find out. You can control that. I believe. Well, you can certainly do it in the XML.
Is there a way to figure out whether
Oh, that's sorry. Those are the wrong ones though.
Is there a way to figure out whether a particular annotation belongs to Spring or to something else?
Yeah, you look at the package name.
Package name.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can actually control the life cycle of these things. Sometimes it's important, usually not. Right? Again, because these things don't really have any state of their own, so it's not like consuming any extra memory one way or the other. Yeah. So it's no big deal. Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the framework, so the application context is like for a web app sort of thing, like when we have, let's say, Tomcat.java running with multiple web apps.
Mm-hmm.
So the application context itself is a per web app.
It's per. So let's be really picky about the terminology here. You're right, but even more specifically, it's per Spring container. I could, hypothetically, have multiple copies of Spring running at the same time in one application. Multiple Spring contexts.
In one application?
Yeah.
And why would you need it?
That's a great question. Right. Yeah, I think it's stupid. if you're using OSGI, then that's something you have to be careful about because you've got different class loaders. So you might have one instance of Spring loading stuff from one class loader and another instance of Spring loading stuff from another class loader. It gets hairy. I've seen that before.
What's the difference between the beans factory loop and the application context sort of thing? Like, I think one is a higher level than the other.
You can essentially think of the application context as containing two things. One is a set of beans that it knows how to manage, and the other is just some additional configuration. So additional configuration like like this, for example, the fact that we're using annotations, right? But primarily, you think of Spring's context as being a collection of beans. That's sort of the.
The beans factory is responsible for doing the simultaneous type of stuff within that context.
You said beans factory? Well, basically, the Spring container is responsible for managing the life cycle of the beans. Yeah. So that's all of this stuff. That's this stuff in core, right? And this is, again, this is good to know about and be able to play with. It's very easy, right? You say in your application context that you're going to be using annotations, and you just declare components and inject them using AutoWired, and 90% of the time you're happy. Okay. There is obviously a bit more stuff that we've seen so far. One is the web side. I've never worked with struts, so I have no idea what that's all about. I don't know anything about portlets, but we've seen that that Spring's Web MVC component, or the Spring's Web MVC module, I guess, provides a servlet. So if we're running inside a servlet container, we can use that servlet, and that particular servlet knows how to talk to the core. So this particular servlet, for example, is able to look at the controllers that are our managed beans in the Spring environment, right? We've got two managed environments that are being managed by two different things at the same time, right? Servlets are being managed by the servlet container. Our Spring beans are managed by the Spring container. And this chunk of code here, essentially the request dispatcher servlet that we saw before, and a few other of those little things, the open entity manager and view filter, which actually lives over here technically, but you can see that it's sort of bridging the gap between those two managed environments, right? AOP, I'll talk about AOP in a second. But ORM, so that's another major component that we've been using, is the ability to inject stuff that would have otherwise been in our J2EE managed environment. Well, we're saying J2EE should not manage Hibernate anymore, right? That was a big change that I made when we converted to Spring. The Java EE environment is not managing Hibernate. Now Spring is managing it. So now that lives over here.
So the ORM is through Hibernate, right? Spring deals with ORM.
Yes, so Spring, again, we can see that in our application context, right? Spring is now managing the data source, right? Java EE doesn't know about our data source anymore. We couldn't look that up in JNDI if we wanted to. It's gone, right? Instead, we inject it using Spring. The entity manager factory, same deal. We can't look that up using persistence.create entity manager factory. It's not in the persistence context in a way that it can deal with. This is injected using Spring now, right? What's the benefit of doing one over the other? Well, basically consistency. If you're using Spring for some things, it's best to use Spring for all of your things, right? Ideally, we wouldn't be using servlets at all, because servlets suck, right? Ideally, we wouldn't be using a Java EE container at all, because Java EE kind of sucks. But that's, that's sort of the constraint that we have, right? So by and large, we try to minimize the things from that one managed environment and just use Spring's managed environment, right? So Spring JDBC, obviously, that's sort of being used under the covers. Spring's RM, we're using that clearly. Our JPA stuff, JPA repository. I have no idea what OXM is. We're not using JMA, so this is like the messaging service, right? We're not using that. And transactions is something that I want to talk about in a little bit. We'll probably talk about it just sort of as a discussion after lunch. We'll see how to use it. I mean, it's very like sort of the 90% case is very straightforward. It's just a single annotation. But in order to understand how this works, we'll need to talk about AOP as well. So let's talk really briefly. Let me see if there's a good diagram here on. Oh man.
Question?
Yes.
So, basically, but you would be able to run Spring within JBoss, right?
Sure.
And let's say if I don't want to do that, I might be able to run it either in Tomcat or in a separate container.
Mm-hmm.
But what other options would I have?
You can run it by itself.
Oh, can you run it by itself?
Yeah, you can run it by itself. It doesn't provide like a web. Doesn't provide a web server.
Okay.
And that's what we use the servlet container for. Is basically just to provide a web server.
Yeah.
You can see though the way that we start Spring. Basically, the way that we boot Spring up in our servlet container is using this Spring context loader listener. Hey, remember we actually implemented a context loader listener of our own, or it was sorry, not a context loader listener. It was what was it called? Maybe it was called that. No, it was called a servlet context listener.
Yes, that was on day one.
Yeah, on day one, remember we needed our setup that would initialize the database when Jetty starts up. Well, Spring implements one of these, right? This context loader listener. So that's what boots Spring up and shuts it down as well, right? When the server shuts down.
But then, in order to do any web application development, you would need a web server, right? And Spring alone wouldn't just work.
Yeah. So maybe somebody's written a component of some Spring bean that you could just use. Yeah. I don't know of such a thing though. I think it's much more common to just use this in a servlet container.
Right, and just to understand.
Yeah. But you can.
What it means to have,
So if, for example, you weren't doing web application development, you were doing instead network development because you work at Cisco and that's what you do. You could not do servlets at all, right? You would just have Spring. You would programmatically instantiate a Spring environment, and some of your beans would be doing raw socket calls.
socket.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So and that's fair.
I mean, that's what I want to understand.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, so again, Spring is providing these connectors between this servlet environment or the Java EE environment and its own. Yeah, but it doesn't require it. So let's talk briefly about AOP, and I'm trying to find a good diagram in here because I don't have any of my own, of course. Wait, that looked like it's a terrible diagram. All right, well, we'll just talk about it really briefly. Aspect J support, maybe? Oh man, this is terrible. All right, well, picture's worth 1,000 words, and there's no pictures, so here's what you get. Wait, maybe? No. Yeah, okay. So the idea with aspect-oriented programming, and if you want to go and just look through this, then that's maybe going to be a better reference anyway. But sort of the high-level overview to AOP is that you want based on some sort of maybe annotations, maybe based on XML, based on something that's sort of out of band, out of line with the Java code. you want some additional behavior to be sort of injected into your code somehow. Actual behavior, right? So far we've talked about just injecting objects where they're needed, right? Somebody's going to provide an instance of this object. Well, we're sort of going to take this to another level and say, I want code to be injected. For example, the example that we're going to use is transactions. If I provide a transactional annotation on a method, or I can do this in XML, but basically, I want some additional code to be sort of stuck into my code that I've written that says begin transaction, end transaction. Right? So that's kind of a different story. It's not we're not depending on objects. We're actually on the fly, essentially rewriting code. The terminology that's used sort of in the programming language, like academic literature, is something called point cuts. This was introduced at Xerox PARC in the late 90s by a small team there, who's then gone on to fame and fortune as low-paid professors at I think at UW or something. The point being, point cuts are the idea. So we say, hey, here's a point at which you're going to inject some code, and it's literally going to do that. The framework will take our bytecode that like our methods consist of some compiled bytecode, and the framework is going to do one of either two things. It's either going to literally take that bytecode and modify it by injecting some additional bytecode, maybe before it, maybe after it, maybe both. Or it's going to take our class and wrap that class in a proxy class. That proxy class will then have some additional code which calls ours, maybe in between some additional generated code. And it depends on the context, but let's say for example we want our okay, that's a terrible example, person controller. Let's say let's say that we had some sort of non-trivial operation in our that was working with multiple repositories, checking a lot of things and maybe updating the repositories, and we wanted to take all of those operations and make them part of one transaction. Right? In Spring, all that we have to do is say that the method is transactional. So I mean, this looks like magic, right? But this is going to be sort of my canonical example here of aspect-oriented programming. What Spring is doing when it sees this annotation is it takes all of this code, literally all of this code, and injects some additional code that says begin transaction, end transaction around the whole thing. Okay. So that would be that's like a simple, very common example of AOP. Another very common use of AOP would be like logging, for example. Right. The idea, and just to take a step back again to understand where AOP came from. The idea behind AOP originally, when they were like developing Aspect.J as a research project at PARC, was to detangle code, right? Oftentimes in your code, you have multiple conflated concerns. The concern of just your basic business logic, like that's one concern. That might need to go to the database and stuff. So that's all part of one concern. But then possibly another concern is logging, or error reporting, or this transactionality, things like that, right? Things that you probably want to do before and after every method. Right? But you don't want to have to actually write that code every time. You don't want to have to, well, right? It basically pollutes your code, or even error handling, right? You can actually think of try-catch as sort of a really primitive form of AOP, right? Right, because I can wrap a whole block of code in a try-catch block. Yeah, instead of what I would have had to do otherwise in C, for example, right? In C, how do we deal with errors? Well, after we do every single operation, we have to check its return value to see if it returned an error result or right. So that was sort of the initial motivation of aspect-oriented programming is to be able to say, okay, well, this one concern, let's deal with it in one place, not 50, right?
Can you, I guess, can you prevent that block of code from being called? Like, say you need something to be, like the user needs to be logged in before you can execute that block of code. Can you prevent that?
Yeah. So that's actually that's another really good example. Is authentication. Yeah, Spring authentication. Let's. It's not here. I forget what it's called. I can't remember what the annotation is called right now, but there is another thing that does exactly what you're talking about, which basically injects a chunk of code that says, hey, before you run anything in this block, make sure the user is an authenticated principal. Yeah, that's a good example of AOP, right?
Would you be able to, for some custom code, right, which you want to execute every time before you do something, would you be able to write your own annotation?
To write your own annotation? Yeah. Yeah.
Have it run?
Yeah, so Spring has this whole AOP module that lets you do that.
Oh.
Yeah. Now we're not going to be getting into that, but that's that's just to sort of give you a sense that let me get back to here, right? So this AOP chunk is used by transactions. It's used. Oh yeah. So here's something that's missing is Spring Security. There's this big Spring Security module that uses AOP, right? Anyway, that's where that comes into play.
Can you give one example of Spring Security where it uses AOP?
Well, like I said, you would basically just on a method that requires you to be logged in, you just annotate that method.
Secured.
At secured, is that what it's called? Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, you can tell I haven't done much work with that.
What about JMS? I mean, I know you don't use it, but does
JMS?
Yeah.
I've never played with it. Or it's like Spring's JMS, I've never played with it. So that's sort of overall like lay of the land, right? Dependency injection is probably the most important thing. That's what lets us have this whole managed environment. That's easy to deal with. When we're doing stuff relating to the servlet environment, it's nice. Well, I mean, it sucks that we have to be in the servlet environment, but at least Spring provides some hooks, right? When we're working with JDBC or JPA, right? Again, it sort of sucks that we have to deal with those, but Spring provides some useful hooks. Transactions again, yeah. So Spring is basically trying to take all of our traditional enterprise Java development and make it easier. Make it less boilerplate, less repetitive. That's if I was going to sum up Spring in one just one sentence, I would say it's just to make this stuff easier and less repetitive, less typing.
You played with sorry, I didn't want to.
No,
have
I'm
you
done.
played with Root?
I knew you were going to ask that. No, I haven't played with Root. Root is crazy. It probably in a good way. Basically, Root ends up generating even more things for you.
What is it? What is it?
It's how do I explain? probably the best analogy that I have would be it's something like Rails, where it just generates lots of code for you. So you'll fill in kind of a stub of what you want things to look like, and it'll just fill in all the implementations.
So you provide an entity. It's a command line shell through which you say, okay, generate entity. I think it automatically generates the controllers and all of those things for you.
Yeah.
And much of it is embedded aspect-oriented programming,
Yeah.
meaning bytecode injected. But
Yes.
if you want to take control of the generated class, you could switch that class and let it generate actual methods that you could edit and all of that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's
Or is
sort
it
of a
big
motto
one?
there's sort of a motto in the Spring community, which is let Rue do it.
Is it pretty popular? Is it picking up?
I think it's picking up.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's picking up at the same time that like Scala is picking up though. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, things are easier in Scala still with Rue around?
I mean, I just think Scala is much easier in general. Like a lot of this nonsense that we have to do in Java is just because Java is so bad. Part of it is because Java EE is bad APIs, but a lot of it is just like Java is bad. Right? When we do functional programming, we have first-class functions. We can structure our code in a very different way that avoids most of our boilerplate altogether. So.
Does Python address that issue?
Yeah, to some degree. Yeah.
Which issue?
Python.
No, which issue?
The issue of boilerplate, repetitive, like
Yeah.
crappy crap. Yeah.
That just functional, being functional in the language.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of frameworks, also, I mean, people love Django and things relating to Django. Yeah. The beef that I have with Python is that it's not statically typed.
Right, yeah.
And I'm like, you can tell that I'm very religious about my statically typed functional languages. So.
You should be happy with C# because it has both.
Grumble. Well, F# I'm interested in.
Huh?
F# I'm interested in. Okay, probably enough for now. Let's. It's like really late lunch. So let's break for lunch. And when we come back, what will we do? When we come back, well, let's see. We talked a little bit about transactions. We'll talk about versioning and optimistic locking. Again, we won't really do any exercises on this because we don't have enough load that we can actually test concurrency stuff with. But we'll talk about what that looks like in Hibernate, and then we'll go on to talk about data constraints in Hibernate. And we'll implement our own custom validations. Okay. REST services, maybe we'll see how we're feeling. Probably end up just doing that stuff tomorrow. Okay. So it's 1 o'clock now. Let's come back at 2. I'm hungry.